Hi guys, Darren here, and today we're going to be painting this guy. So, let's have a good look at this model without it for... Oh, yeah, okay. But now I've managed to secure the model with a bit of blue tag. You can see that this is just a really nicely detailed model, which is what you'd expect from Games Workshop, really. I've decided to paint the two bits separately, so the goblin separate to the base, just because there's so much detail under that coat that you just can't get to. Right, let's get into the painting. So here I'm using an off-white from Vallejo. You will see quite a heavy Vallejo theme throughout this video. They've not sponsored the video, but I just love their paint range, to be honest. Now, you might be asking yourself, why has he painted the snow before he's painted the brickwork? Well, to be honest, I don't really know. For these commemorative series models, I always like to copy the box art as close as I can. Now, the whole red makes a really nice colour for these tiles. So there's quite a few different brick colours on the box art, so decided to just mix in a bit of German grey to give it a bit of variety. Now moving on to the goblin sack. No, grow up. So we'll start with an Iraqi sand, but we'll build this up to sort of like a white colour in the end. Now I'm going for a scale colour forest green for these Christmas lights. Now a bit of a debate as to whether the lights would actually be on or not, but I don't think it was ever really solved. I'm just painting the candy cane grappling hook, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. Now I've just gone over the snow with a really thinned down version of deep sky blue, which I think gives it a nice frosty feel. So I'm not going to bore you with taking you through every single step, but most of it's just sort of applying the base colours really, and in this case just copying what's on the box, which does make it a lot easier. So whilst you're watching me apply these base colours, I'll just give you a little bit of history on Gobbo. He is the leader of the rebel Grots, and to be honest, there is no single red Gobbo. The position rotates between various members of the committee after an election. Donning a red cape and wielding a custom slugger, he leads the Grots in their efforts to overthrow the oppression of the Orcs in the Revolution. If you're interested in knowing what brushes I'm using a Artist Opus Series S size 1. I really like these brushes. I picked them up about a year ago and I've sort of never looked back, to be honest. They are more expensive than other brushes you can pick up, but I think they've really helped me level up my paint game, and they do hold their point really nicely. Here I'm just picking out all the tiny little details on this model, mainly sort of the presents in the sack and things like that. I think it was only when I came to paint this model I realised how many details it actually had and how many different colours that you sort of need to do it justice. I've started using the Dark Star metals and I'm just using a steel here, but these metals are actually really good. They come out of the pot quite thin, which sort of just helps application. You don't have to put on a really thick coat. Sometimes they need 2 coats, but the finish is really nice. I'm going in here with the old trusty Agrax Earthshade. I'm sure if you've painted any miniature, you've probably used this wash. So yeah, just to give that sack the definition. To be honest, it's probably going to go over pretty much everything on this model at some point. I find that when I'm working with browns or reds, the Agrax or Nuln Oil always bring out the details in the best way. So here I'm just using Nuln Oil to go over the brickwork, just to sort of go in the shades and give it a nice bit of contrast. So I'm going to go back over the snow just with a really thin layer of sky blue, which gives it that nice frosty feel. Now, I do end up putting Vallejo snow all over this, but forget about that for a minute. Now I do decide to paint the base rim sort of halfway through, which is completely random. Hi guys, hope you're really enjoying the video so far. If you want to see more content like this, please remember to just hit that subscribe button and it helps us do what we do. Right, let's get back to the video. We've got to the point now where everything is washed, so to speak. So we're just going to look at picking out the sort of the top details and giving it a bit of contrast, bit of definition. We're going to start with the snow and then just use a bit of pale sand to start picking out those highlights on the bag, and then we're just going to slowly build it up just to really give it a bit of contrast. Lately I've been concentrating on making the highlights quite stark, so I'll be looking for this to be quite bright by the time we get to the top highlight. Usually I'd build up to an almost white, which I'm going to do here, and that is helped by the fact that the snow has got that sort of blue hue to it after we've gone over with the thin sky blue. So it enables the sack to be quite bright, but also not sort of bleed into that snow. Recently, I've been looking into stipple glazing, which I'm definitely interested in doing a little bit more of. Now, I've sort of tried to do a little bit here. It's mainly sort of edge highlighting and just applying the layer on quite thinly, but I have sort of started to do a little bit of kind of stippling on the edges, and I think with enough layers you can really bring it out. So I've sort of tried it again on this sort of brickwork, just so rather than going over with a layer, you're sort of glazing and the colour from underneath comes through too. Really, the main first thing that I'm doing with these stages is just going back over with the original colour. So after the wash has been applied, just going back over with either the original colour or a slightly brighter version, just to make them pop a bit. Because this model is quite comic-y, I'm not bothered about the transitions being ultra smooth, and I think it's starting to come together and sort of look quite comic-y. Is comic-y a word? Anyway, I'm putting this Vallejo snow on. So I sort of had this idea, and it was partly Dickie's idea as well. Looks a bit like that American fluff, but I've not really used it before, and putting it on, it really does make a difference. I'm going to leave the base for now and start working on the goblin. We're starting with a white. I mean, any white's fine. I'm not going to be too prescriptive. I'm showing you sort of the main colours that I'm using, but of course you can use any red, you know. And as a base colour, it doesn't really matter too much. You know, we're going to put some darker colours in the shades and, you know, in the recesses, and put some lighter ones on the highlights. So at this stage, it doesn't really matter too much what shade of red you're going for. And to be honest, that kind of is the same for all the colours that I've used. I'm not saying you need to use these colours, these are just the ones that I've used. So the Goblin green, I would recommend a nice bright sort of yellowy green. Really does make the skin pop and contrast with the red. Any of you guys that know about colour theory will know that red and green go very well together. So I think this model does sort of pull really nicely together, especially with the kind of the red and green elements that are also on the base. Sort of ties the whole model in really nicely. Now, I'd say the bit that I've just done is probably the most difficult bit on this model, the freehand stripes on that stick of dynamite. I'm just now going over with the metal. He's got a couple of stars, one on his belt, and then he's got another one on his hat. And there's just like a grenade in his back pocket as well. So just getting all the metal done at the same time. And then going over with this brass. You can't see that bit, but he's got a couple of little shells on his waist, on his belt. So yeah, just getting those little details in. Got to get that bit of steel on his slugger. And yeah, I think it's starting to come together. Again, this isn't really meant to be like an expert guide to how to paint this model, but I think it's just interesting just to see the process of how a model starts to come together. And then normally it's when you sort of get to that stage where you can wash it that, you know, you really start to pick out those details, and it you know, starts to look more how it's going to look in the end. With the fire and smoke, I sort of made it up as I went along, as you can probably tell. Now, I think we'll go back more on that later, but for now, let's just go over the whole thing with Agrax Earthshade and just sort of see which details start to pop out, and then, you know, we can then start to really refine highlights and things like that. Depending on the models, sort of normally depends on how thick I apply the wash. On this stick of dynamite, it actually recesses really nicely, and I know on some models, you know, you definitely don't want it too thick, but I think where this model has that comic style, I do want the recesses to be quite dark, so I'm not being too fussy about how thick this goes on. That said, you know, you wouldn't want it pulling, so here I'm just taking off some, you know, some bits where it has pulled. I'm starting to just go over the fire here and just put a few little bits of grey and start to just spot a few bits of grey. Now, I actually end up covering most of this flame, just leaving a little bit uncovered, which I think works quite well. And then the plan is to then sort of go back over that with a lighter grey, just on the sort of tip of the flame, and then or the smoke, and then again go over with a lighter grey and just those very tips, and I think it sort of achieves quite a nice effect. And again, you're going for a more comic-y style, so it needs to be a bit more obvious than sort of a extremely smooth transition. Now, I've forgotten to do the Nuln Oil on the weapon, so I've just gone back and done that quickly. And we're going to go in with a lime green just to start to do these highlights. And the reason I've gone with such a jump up of colour is just because of that sort of comic style and the fact that we want these highlights to be quite stark and quite directional. So I think that works quite well. And you know, once we get the white on there for the dynamite, it actually really does stand out. The aim for the highlight stage, because of that sort of quite stark style, is to just pick out the bits that the light would be hitting, just with a much brighter version of the base colour. And so I'm starting here with the white, and then just going on to things like the red, and starting to really pick out the highlights on that coat. Now, we're going to do a couple of different things with the coat. So first of all, we are going over with a brighter version of that base colour, and then I think it's sort of already starting to look quite good. And then we're going to start to just mix in a little bit of orange with the red and just go over again and just sort of pick those highlights out. Now, the next stage is something where, you know, we're going to do something a bit different. So we're going to take a dark purple and we're going to start to glaze this into the recesses. Now this really gives the model some depth. So working on colour theory, you know, you would get those sort of slightly purpley colours in the recesses. And I think, again, for a comic style, it does really help the model pop. Now, when we twin this with adding a little bit more orange and then going back over with the highlights, it really gives quite a large amount of contrast on the model and starts to really make it pop, as you can see here. So we're just going to add those final layers of sort of that orangey red, and then just going over the gun with a light silver just to give that a little bit of definition, and then kind of just going over and cleaning up a few of the other bits. So a couple of highlights in the eyes and just sort of doing a little bit of cleanup here. He's got a bauble on there, so just putting a little highlight on there, and then we're just going to go over the skin in the same way, just with that very bright lime green. So we can now put the goblin back on the base, and I'm going back in with the Vallejo snow just to tie the goblin into the base a bit more. So putting a bit of snow around his boots and on the bottom of his coat, so you know, you can really imagine that coat's being dragging through the snow, and I really think it does work. So that's the model finished. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed painting it. And there you have it, another goblin on his way to spoil Christmas. Really hope you enjoyed the video, guys. See you next time.